Part of doing this SummerSlam review series, just like doing other retro pay-per-view review series, is you get to talk about some truly great shows, and then you get to talk about some truly special shows. But then on the flip side of that, and it kind of goes along with it, that unfortunately means you have to muddle through the waters of some so-so shows and just some flat-out bad shows. And SummerSlam 1993 definitely fits more into the bad category for me. This is just a show that I never really measured up back then, and I definitely don't think it measures up now. There's a lack of star power clearly on this show. There is a lack of a defining signature match or, frankly, even storyline on this show in terms of from a good standpoint, unless you're big about getting on board the Lex Express. So anyways, let's get started talking about SummerSlam 1993. Now, for the company, this is definitely a period of huge transition. I mean, absolutely huge transition. No more Hogan. No more Flair. No more Savage in the ring, at least for this pay-per-view. No more Ultimate Warrior. So they were missing some big stars, some huge stars. You know, Hogan was gone from the company. Flair was gone from the company. Warrior was gone from the company. Savage is primarily doing commentary at this point in time again. You know, that's some big-time star power for any company to try and overcome, especially when they don't have big-time ready-made stars in the wings ready to take over and take the mantle for the company. And you saw that here on this show. You know, this is just a lot of things were off about the WWF between 1993 and 1995. I'm just calling it as I see it. You occasionally would get a really good show like you would maybe with a WrestleMania 10, but boy, there were a lot of stinkers, and to be SummerSlam 93 is definitely a stinker. When you open up Razor Ramon versus Ted DiBiase, this is something that should really seem to work on the surface and be really good. It was okay, but you'll never remember it. And your WWF Tag Team Championship match, the Steiner brothers versus the Heavenly Bodies. This was at a time where the WWF obviously had a huge hard-on for Jim Cornette's Smoky Mountain Wrestling, and he allowed their tag champs, basically the Heavenly Bodies, to come in and challenge the WWF tag champs, the Steiner brothers. And again, the dynamics of this really didn't work to me. This was a largely, in my opinion anyways, forgettable WWF Tag Team Championship match, although I'm sure somebody will take to defending the Heavenly Bodies and how great of workers they were and how great of a tag team they were. And I'm not denying that, and I'm not saying that's not true. But that doesn't mean that I enjoyed this match, because I didn't. You know, this was even a show that had some disappointment. Like when I went back and watched Shawn Michaels versus Mr. Perfect for the Intercontinental Championship. Maybe this is in part because you saw Bret Hart versus Mr. Perfect at SummerSlam 91 for the title. Then, of course, 92, it's Davey Boy Smith versus Bret Hart for the IC title, main eventing SummerSlam at London, England, at Wembley Stadium. Then you come here and you see Shawn Michaels and you see Mr. Perfect, two of the truly great Intercontinental champions of all time, and you see him here in 1993, and you would expect more than an average passable match. And you would hope you would get something with more of a distinct, clear-cut finish, and you got neither one of those here. This was average. This was passable. But definitely doesn't measure up to the standards of the match in 92, and certainly doesn't even measure up to the standards of 91. This is just another match on the card. It probably was the best match of the night, but again, that's not necessarily saying a whole lot. Another match that tied into the Money Inc. Group was IRS versus the 1-2-3 Kid. Again, it is what it is. You were introducing a relatively new character. Whatever. You can move on from that. One thing that always pissed me off about this show and pissed me off about the WWF during this time was that for some reason they had this really huge big hard-on for smashing Jerry Lawler into featured spots and storylines, and in particular him and Bret Hart, because while you could sit there and say 1994 was primarily dedicated to Bret versus Owen, you still had Jerry Lawler incorporated there, and in fact they kept going to the well with this shit all the way on to SummerSlam 1995 when Hart takes on fucking Isaac Yankem. And here you've got Bret Hart having to work two matches, first against Doink the Clown, and then after he beats Doink by disqualification, then here comes Jerry Lawler who beats him by disqualification, and it was just terrible. You have one of the best in-ring workers of all time. You have arguably the best in-ring worker of your company at that time, and this is how you choose to deploy him, and this is how you choose to utilize him, with 2 forgettable matches smack dab in the middle of the freaking card, coming off of a time, mind you, where he was the WWF champion just a few months before, and he had actually main evented WrestleMania 9. A lot of things were off about the WWF at this time. Ludwig Borga. That's it. All I need to say. Undertaker, Giant Gonzalez, rest in peace match. That's what everybody got when they saw this. They went to fucking sleep. This was terrible. How dare the company ever stick Taker with Giant Gonzalez and expect him to work a long program with him and make it work. And then you get to the main event. Oh, good God almighty. This is one of these things that it shows to a certain degree the arrogance of the WWF/WWE machine, even going back then. No more did they have the all-American muscle-bound blonde Hulk Hogan, so they decided they were going to go find themselves another muscle-bound blonde and make him the new all-American hero of the 90s, and that is Lex Luger. Get on board! The Lex Express! Oh, Jesus Christ. He's going on a cross-country tour! Oh, Jimenez. He went for being the narcissist of this. Now, I will say in the setup to this, when you're on the aircraft carrier for the 4th of July, and here comes Lex Luger, the American hero, to come body slam Yokozuna, the WWF champion who had just beaten Hulk Hogan for that title at King of the Ring. There were some good elements here. USA versus Japan. Great storyline maybe in the 50s and the 60s. In the 90s, don't care so much anymore. But it was set up to very well. The problem is that it was ultimately Yokozuna versus Lex Luger, excuse me. And, this match here was not nearly as good, in my opinion, as their match that they would have at WrestleMania 10 in the middle of that card. And it's just the whole dynamics of this as you go back and watch it. You see Yokozuna having to try and carry Lex Luger to a really good match. Carried him to a solid match, but again, Yoko was great, but he couldn't work miracles. And the whole thing is you're sitting here and you're really legitimately, as you go back and watch it, you're rooting die hard for Yokozuna. And that's not to piss off some of the old WCW fans, I'm sure, will take to the comments and talk about how great Luger was and how awesome it was when he won the WCW title. And I'll agree it was. But him as the Lex Express was just bad, and it just shows when you go back and watch this, just how out of whack and out of touch Vince McMahon and the WWF were at this time. You were getting into the heart of the steroid trial. They had some other problems. You were losing top stars. This was not a good period for the company. And it's hard to go back and watch some of these shows like SummerSlam 93 because you're left relatively unimpressed. You sit there and think to yourself, man, some of these gimmicks were really stupid. The matches relatively were underwhelming, and it really lacked that signature kind of marquee match. Like I said, Shawn Michaels versus Mr. Perfect was probably the class of the night, and that on many other SummerSlam cards would just be a mediocre match. That was the best match of the night, and it was disappointing. Not a good sign. You utilize your guy that main evented WrestleMania 9 as the champion in 2 matches in the middle of the card with Doink the Clown and Jerry the King Lawler. Good Christ. The show was bad. There are certain shows that you should skip and not bother because there's really no redeeming qualities to it. SummerSlam 1993 is one of them. I promise you. You'll thank me for not going back and watching it.